Naming things in your scene, especially your bones, is a super important habit to get into early on. So in this lesson, I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about my naming convention and your naming convention. First, what is a naming convention? It's a set of rules that you stick to when you're naming things. This makes things consistent, easy to remember, and hopefully logical. Technically, your naming convention doesn't need to be the same as mine or anyone else's for that matter, although there are some inbuilt features in Blender that you can use to your advantage as a rigger, and there are already some common conventions out there. So with a smart naming convention, you can save yourself a bunch of time and mental energy. I'll do my best to explain what all this means, but I'll start by talking about some of my rules. Name everything. This means bones, objects, armatures, data, absolutely everything. Now, we're not going to worry about this rule for some of the demonstrations in this course where we're just adding bones or showing the tools, etc. However, when we're creating something real, inverted commas, we're certainly going to do things properly. Be consistent. A good naming convention should be consistent. Now, it's okay if your naming convention changes or evolves over time, but it should remain consistent within the same rig or project. Make it easy to read. Now, I've purposely made that difficult to read for comical effect and to emphasize my point. At the end of the day, you are the one that needs to be reading these bone names and connecting everything, as well as an animator. They need to be able to read the names and find those names in the graph editor and the dope sheet. So if you have a name that is easy to read, it's going to make everyone's life a lot easier. You also shouldn't just copy what someone else has in their naming convention without thinking about it first. There are some common conventions out there, so sure, it really makes sense to use the same thing because everybody already knows what you're talking about. But if it's redundant, like some conventions that come from other software, or if it's someone else's bad habit, I really want you to think about it before you decide to add it to your naming convention. I'll speak about this more later on. Be logical. Now, sometimes this might mean that you need to break one of your rules in order to keep it logical. And I think this is more important than trying to find that perfect naming system that's going to work in every situation. Sometimes you just need to break one rule in order to make it logical for that situation. And don't do things more than once when you don't have to. If your character is symmetrical or has some symmetrical parts, Blender has some inbuilt features to be able to copy your work from one side to the other, as long as you have an appropriate naming convention. So let's have a look at that right now. When you're dealing with a part of the rig that is symmetrical, for example, a left arm and a right arm, Blender is smart enough to recognize the left and the right sides as long as you use an appropriate naming convention, as I mentioned. You need to tell it which is the left and the right sides by either using a suffix or a prefix, and you'll need to use a separator as well. There's many valid examples, so let's go through some of them now. Here's a bone. I'm going to give it a name, bone_name. Pretty good, I know. And now we need to give it a prefix or a suffix. Here is a list of all the valid options, and I'm only showing you the left here, but obviously the opposite of that would be the right. But I don't need to show you that many examples. I can just do it with the one side here. So the first one here is a lowercase l. Then we have an uppercase L. We can use the whole word left, and there's many different spellings using uppercases and lowercases. But we do have 4 valid separators, and that would be the decimal point or a period. You can use a space, a hyphen, or an underscore. So let me just choose one of these valid examples. I'll go with bonename.l, and I'm using the uppercase L. This would be acceptable, and it is by far the most commonly used suffix convention. We could do something different. We could go left_bonename. This would be valid as well. And just a little bit of a note here, the separator that you use for the prefix or the suffix doesn't have to be the same as any of the other ones in the name. They can be different, but in fact, it's probably better if it is different, which I'll explain why in a moment too. But first, let's have a look at some bad examples, some names that won't symmetrize. Here we've got left name, and this won't work because there's no separator. Blender would just see this as one big chunk of letters and not know what to do with it. Here we've got name left, and that won't work for exactly the same reason. In this example, we have name.l.more words, and this won't work either because the L is in the middle of the name and Blender will get confused. Although there is one exception to this, and that is if you use the name.l.001 or a similar number scheme. Blender is smart enough to figure this out because this is one of its own internal naming conventions. When it duplicates a bone or any object, in fact, and that name already exists, it's going to append a 001 to the end. So if you do have these type of numbers on the end, it will symmetrize. Although this is not good practice in my opinion, because it creates inconsistencies for the animators, and it is also less clear to read. So even though it does work, I don't recommend it. So let's jump into Blender and have a look at how we symmetrize these bones from one side to the other, and what the Symmetrize tool does and doesn't do. So here we are inside Blender, and I've already gone ahead and set up a little bit of an example here with a whole bunch of valid names that will symmetrize across to the other side. Now I don't need to spell them all out, but you can see we've got some suffixes and prefixes and different separators and whatnot. You can have a play with this file if you like. It's included in the downloads. So here in the middle, I have the middle of my object. Now this is just a bone that I've placed here. This is not a special bone at all. That's just kind of like a visual reminder about where this center of our container object is. And all these bones are on the screen right, which is essentially the left-hand side of the character. So I can select any of these bones that I like and symmetrize them across to the other side, because as I said, these names are all valid. I can do that by bringing up my context menu, which is right click by default, but for me I press the W key, and then you can see this symmetrize option here. You can also find this up here in the armature menu under symmetrize here. And when we click that, it's going to mirror what we had selected over to the other side. It has mirrored the orientation as well as the bone roll. You can see we have a bone roll of 8 on the left side, but a -8 on the right side. So what else does the symmetrize operator do? Well, as you saw, if the bone doesn't exist on the opposite side, it's going to create it. It's going to set up the parenting and mirror that if it's applicable. And it's going to copy the constraints as well and mirror the constraint targets if that's applicable as well. I have put a little asterisk next to these last two here because Blender is going to do its best with what you give it. It's going to try and symmetrize the parenting and constraint targets, but if those bones don't exist or the targets aren't being symmetrized at the same time, then it can't actually complete that, and it's just going to leave the parenting and the constraint targets the same as the original bone. But if you're symmetrizing everything together, it's going to work as you expect. So what doesn't the Symmetrize tool do? It's not going to symmetrize any bone collections. So if you have them in a collection called collection.L, it's not going to put those new bones into a new collection called collection.R. It's going to leave them in the collection where they are. You'll manually have to adjust that. And it also won't do anything with the drivers. It won't mirror them. In fact, it won't even copy them. So anything to do with collections and drivers is something that you're going to have to manually adjust. I have written a bunch of scripts that automates this for you, and they are available for download in the more advanced rigging course, that is the rigging playbook, but the Python stuff is beyond the scope of this fundamentals course. But it is just something you need to be aware of. And now for the two final awesome things that this Symmetrize tool does, and you can think about this as it is a way to update your existing work. I'm back in the same example, and you can see I have a constraint on this bone here. I'm also going to go one step further and actually move this in edit mode, just change this whole bone around. And you can see it hasn't updated the other side. If I re-symmetrize this bone now, not only will it update the corresponding bone on the other side, but if I jump into pose mode, it's copied that constraint across and it has mirrored it correctly because the target bone already existed on this side. All right, let's just do a little bit of an experiment now. I'm going to delete the constraint on this side and then jump into edit mode and update everything, and you'll see it has also deleted the bone on that side. The only kind of strange thing about that is it's something that affects pose mode, but you need to activate it in edit mode. But once you kind of get your head around that, then you can implement it into your workflow and save yourself a bunch of time. There's one other option for symmetry. Up here, there's a button called X-axis mirror. It looks like a little butterfly with the two halves. This will mirror any changes from one side to the other side in real time. But you can see there's an option for pose mode, and we have that same option in edit mode. If we enable this in edit mode, we can update any changes to our bone on the other side in real time. This won't do the constraints, but it will do the positioning of that bone as long as the naming convention can be correctly symmetrized. We don't want this in pose mode because we're updating the animation. We're not updating any of the rest positions. So you don't actually want this enabled in pose mode for rigging, but it is an option that you can turn on and off in edit mode when it's best going to assist you. Sometimes it does get in your way, but if you combine this with the Symmetrize tool, it's going to speed up your workflow greatly. So let's talk about my full naming convention, starting at the object level. Here is our beloved Melvin character, and this character only has 2 objects in his rig, but others can have more. We have the Melvin underscore rig, that is the name of the armature object, and then we have Melvin underscore geo, which is short for geometry. I always like to have the character name first, and then the label of what it is second. That way it's always going to remain alphabetical. But here's one of the inconsistencies with my naming convention. I have all caps for geo here, and then just title case for the word rig. Now I do this for readability, and I've tried many different iterations of this, and in fact I did try to make it consistent on a project once by making the rig all caps, but I got pushback from the director saying, can you change it back, because it feels like the character's name is shouting at us. So I think this is one of those inconsistencies that I may just have to live with. It's also worth noting before we move on that these are the names of the container objects. I also duplicate the same names and use them for the data. And if you get into this habit early on, it's going to make your life a lot easier when you have to append data from one file into another. Just trust me on that one. Now, in this example, we only had 2 objects, but as I mentioned before, we could have many more objects that make up your rig. You could have a mesh cage or a deformation cage to help the character move. In that case, I would call it Melvin underscore cage. If you just had 1 lattice, you could call it Melvin underscore lattice. But if you had more than 1, then you would give it an extra label, but keep the names alphabetically together. So you would have Melvin lattice head and Melvin lattice body, for example. Labeling things with a suffix on the object level is my personal preference, and I do something slightly differently when we're talking about bones. Now, before we get stuck into the bone names and how I name them, let's look at some of the common pre-existing conventions out there. There's a common convention to name some of your bones with certain labels like def, mech, control, IK, and FK, and then maybe some other labels like viz and org. Now you might come across some other abbreviations, but really most of them are just personal preference rather than industry standard in my opinion. So what do all of these labels mean? Well, def stands for deformation. These are the bones that actually deform your mesh. If you label them clearly, it's going to make your life a lot easier. MCH or mech is short for mechanism. These bones are needed to make your rig function in a specific way. They're helper bones. Essentially, they don't move the geometry, but they help the other bones do what you need them to do. Now, control, this should be pretty obvious. These are the controls that the animators will use, although this is a redundant label, so you don't actually need to use this one, and I'll explain why in a moment. And then we have IK and FK. That stands for inverse kinematics and forward kinematics, and you'll learn about that later in the course. But you would only use these labels when it makes sense. So if you had a limb that would switch between an IK and an FK version, then it makes sense to actually put this label there. But it would be redundant to label everything with FK if that body part or that component didn't have an IK equivalent. Now the viz label, this is another type of mechanism bone just to help you visualize. It's something that the animator would see, but they wouldn't be able to control. It's just a visual helper. And org stands for original. Now this is something that is used in the Rigify add-on. And technically these are just a different version of a mechanism bone. However, in the fundamentals course, we're not dealing with Rigify, so you don't need to really worry about those. Now, when I name a bone chain, what I like to do is give it a numerical number working from the start of the chain to the end. So just imagine that this is an antenna. This would be called antenna 1, antenna 2, antenna 3, antenna 4. And as you can see, I like to separate that segment number from the name portion using an underscore. This makes it easy to read in my opinion, rather than cramming the number on the end of the name. So where do I put the labels that we've spoken about before? Well, if these were deformation bones, I will put the label at the start as a prefix. I used to use a suffix, but I have adapted my naming convention to be more in line with Rigify. Now I've changed the way that I do things for 2 reasons. 1, so I'm teaching a way that is more universal across the whole entire Blender sphere, and it's not purely based on my personal preferences. It's more in line with industry standard, so to speak. And also, it's easier to write scripts and to do specific things if the labels are at the start of the names. Now, we won't actually be writing any scripts or looking at Rigify in this fundamentals course, but in future courses we will. And that means you won't need to adapt the way you work at all. It will plug into your current workflow. Okay, so let's get back on track about these names. So why is control redundant in Blender? Well, as a rigger, you should hide and lock all the bones that the animator doesn't need to touch. And that means pretty much everything that isn't a control bone. So they should only have access to these special bones that they move around. But putting CTRL on the name of every one of these bones means that the animator actually has to start looking part way through the word to actually start reading it. And there can be hundreds of controls. And if they all start with CTRL, that does not help with the readability factor. CTRL is redundant. When it comes to organizing your objects in the outliner, this is the method that I use. I always have a master collection that is going to be home for all of the components. And I give that a name in all caps. Then underneath that, I have a specific collection for all the different types of components. So I have character_rig, that would be where the rig or the rigs go. Sometimes you can have more than one armature, but that's where they would go. I will put all of the geometry inside the character_geo. Then if the character needed any helper meshes like lattices or whatnot, I would stick them in another collection called character_util, short for utilities. And then finally, I put a duplicate link to the rig in the master collection. That's just a linked copy in two collections. It's not duplicating the rig or anything. That's just so that the rig is easy to find on the top level rather than the animator having to dig through all these sub collections. Other riggers might use different methods to structure things, but this is just the way that I work and it's personal preference. I do think there's some other small things that I do in specific circumstances. However, at this fundamentals level, these are all the main concepts that you'll need to know. Plus, there's enough information for you in here for you to intuit what to do in other situations. Now, as I said, your naming convention doesn't need to be the same as mine. Just make sure that it's logical and be prepared to improve it over time.